Hello and welcome to the
I watched in Russian.
in my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. It is with great pleasure today that I have Stephen Edgington as my guest. Stephen, before I make a larger introduction, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yes, you did. Well done.
Okay,
Most
good. But usually it's the German names that are troubling the English speakers. But in your case, I think I had to correct your name in my address book 3 times. I had Eddington and Edgington and Edgington. So this was a very difficult thing. Now, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have you on the show is I consider you to be one of the best interviewers in the English-speaking world at the moment. Like, you have talked to historians like Tom Holland, psychologists like Jordan Peterson. You've talked to politicians, and what I very much enjoy is these are never fluffy on the surface interviews. You go to the very issues that people care about, and this is why I think, for a very good reason, both the entire interviews, which I recommend anybody to watch, but also the clips that go viral on social media do so, because the questions you ask are the important ones. So you are still, if you allow me to say this, I'm not going to ask you for your age, but I would say you're significantly younger than me, so you're still a young man. Tell us a little bit, how did it happen? Did you venture into this career path and said, okay, I want to not just engage with politics out of interest, but I actually want to talk with decision makers, both in politics, but also popular culture?
You know, it really started when I was a teenager. I was a very odd young man and was interested in politics, interested in history. And I just started reaching out to people when I was at school, completely out of the cold, cold calling people, cold emailing people, journalists, politicians in Britain. And I asked for interviews, filming myself for my own YouTube channel. And I was really interested at the time about Brexit. Brexit was a huge issue, obviously, leading up to 2016 and the years after 2016 in Britain. And as a teenager, being politically engaged, that was really the thing that I was fascinated with. I was in favor of Brexit, still am. And that political moment, that political movement in Britain, I think it really got a lot of young people interested in politics. And for me, I wanted to interview politicians and interview journalists that I was watching on the television, watching on YouTube, about Brexit and about the issues surrounding Brexit: constitution, immigration, sovereignty, trade, things like that. And those interviews, some of them did pretty well on YouTube. And that's how I really started my career, building up a kind of network of people that I knew in the political world. You know, my parents aren't political, really. They don't know anyone in that arena. So I'd really built my own network from scratch as a teenager and just worked from there, worked at lots of different places now. Really, my whole career, other than a couple of jobs, but I've been doing these long form interviews for various different organizations.
Yeah, what I find so remarkable about you, and I mean, full disclosure, we know each other personally. You are, I think, the definition of a non-attention seeking individual. So what I mean by this is your motivation obviously was never to bask in the fame or the popularity of the people that you interviewed. I think it was always driven by genuine interest in what they had to say, and what their positions were. Do you think there has been a lack of the kind of conversations that you had with these people in the media? So do you feel that you're filling a niche that has been neglected for quite a while?
Maybe I was at the beginning, because there wasn't quite as many long form podcasters as there are today. I have to say that space has really been filled. I mean, I'm talking about a British context here. In America, it's slightly different, but there seems to be a lot of people who are doing these very long form conversations on YouTube. And I think that's partly because there's a huge audience for it, obviously, and that's built up because of people like Joe Rogan and others. But also there's a lot of money to be made, frankly, from doing these longer conversations on YouTube. And I feel that it's really saturated now on YouTube. You can get these long form discussions anywhere, really. Lots and lots of different YouTube channels doing this, lots of different people doing it, which is great. But it also means that perhaps some of the quality is lost, and perhaps some of the people doing it, like you say, are interested in having a kind of media career or becoming a kind of personality online. And I think, well, I hope that my motivation, it really is out of genuine curiosity. I want to have interesting discussions, interesting conversations. And I think sometimes that can be lost through a lot of the so-called clickbait on YouTube. And, we all have to do a bit of that. But yeah, I think maybe at the beginning, that was really, 2016, 2015, I was really part of a very kind of new phenomenon, really. And yeah, I've just been doing it ever since.
Now, when you prepare for an interview, so that we can a little bit of an insight into how the sausage is made, what are some of the key steps that you undertake in preparation?
It's so bad to say this, but it really depends on the interview how much preparation I'm going to be doing, because I've done so many interviews over my career. I know I'm still only 26, but I've done hundreds and hundreds of these interviews. I think that the best way to approach these interviews is not to necessarily have a set list of very hard questions that you're going to ask them that you stick to throughout the interview. I do generally write a list of questions beforehand, but I try not to stick with them. I want to have a conversation. Actually, when I first started out doing these interviews, one of the people that I was interviewing a lot, I haven't interviewed him in a long time, is Peter Hitchens. And I said to him, this is literally when I was 17, what's your advice to me as an interviewer? Because obviously he's been interviewed, countless times throughout his decades-long career. And he said, Stephen, the number one thing that you can do that will make you stand out from almost all other interviewers is to listen to your guests and respond to what they're telling you. And I really took that to heart. So when I have these interviews, these conversations, I'm trying to listen to the other person, and I'll take something that they say and I'll follow up on that, or I'll challenge them or whatever. And really so that it's an actual dialogue and not just me sticking to some kind of rigid script. Now, if I do sort of get to an end of a topic or something, I will move on to another question that I've prepared. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on the person. Like sometimes I'll do a lot of research beforehand and really think deeply about what kind of questions I'm going to ask. But sometimes if it's a guest that I've spoken to on several occasions, if it's about a topic that I know a lot about, say, British politics, American politics, or whatever, then I don't have to do too much preparation or research into the topic. I just know that I'm going to have a really interesting, in-depth conversation with someone with so much knowledge. And it's really my job to draw out the best from those people. So whether it's someone like David Starkey or Victor Davis Hanson, who I'm going to interview in a couple of hours, I feel it's my responsibility to, as I say, find the best in them. And I love history, so I'm always trying to bring in a kind of historical connection. I love interviewing historians. So I suppose this is just a passive thing that I do. It's not necessarily preparing for interviews. I just do it because I enjoy it. But I read a lot of history, and I try and use that knowledge in the interviews that I'm conducting, particularly with the historical figures, but also sometimes with the politicians, which can be quite fun.
Now, those who follow you on social media know that, and again, I think this is a very honest approach by you, that you have also your own political convictions. Has it ever happened to you that somebody whom you requested for an interview refused, and they said, "Oh no, we're not going to talk to Stephen because he's, part of the new right, or we will only talk to Stephen if he sticks precisely to a set of questions," or that even somebody broke off an interview and said, "This is it," and they stood up in a huff and left the interview?
I don't think I've ever had someone walk out of an interview. Maybe I have. I'll have to rack my brains. But I have had people deny interview requests. So I do a big part of my job is making documentaries. It's not just doing long form interviews. And as a part of these documentaries that I produce, obviously I do a lot of interviews with individuals, and some of these documentaries focus really on the left. And I've done lots of films in the States talking about left-wing issues. So I did a film about reparations for Black people. More recently, I did a film about the far left and Antifa and, far left violence. I did a film in Dearborn about Muslim immigration and Islamic impact in that city in Detroit. And a lot of the time, the people that I'm requesting to do interviews with obviously politically disagree with me, and they've Googled me And I've had some very, very rude emails, from people saying, I'm not going to do an interview with some fascist or whatever. Sometimes that happens. And particularly because of the organizations that I work for, GB News, people perceive it to be as obviously on the right, and people in America, if they do their research, they can get quite uppity about that. And, particularly some Islamic scholars and preachers and so on, they definitely were more wary of GB News than other people are. But I do get this thing in America where, because Americans don't really know about British media, sometimes I'm lucky and I'm able to interview people that perhaps people from Fox or people from other conservative media groups here can't interview, just out of sheer ignorance of the people that I'm reaching out to interview. They don't know that it's necessarily going to be more confrontational than they expect. So I've done some very confrontational interviews with people here in the States, mostly with these Islamic imams and scholars and preachers in Dearborn. So that was a really interesting film to make last year. And I have had people who I've interviewed then threaten to sue me after the interview, or tell me to take it down or not to release it because they weren't happy with my questions. And I'm very fortunate that all the organizations that I've worked for have backed me up when that happens, where people are demanding to take stuff down. And we've always published it, or if they're threatening to sue, particularly the Telegraph were very, very good at this. They would ignore that, and we would press ahead because we weren't in the wrong, and we have a right as journalists to release stuff.
I mean, as a journalist, as an interviewer, as a documentary filmmaker, do you consider the main role of the media, or the kind of media also that you produce, as being the chronicler, let's say, of our age, of our time? Or do you also consider that it has a task to influence politics or to influence the direction of society? So are you considering yourself more as an observer, or as somebody who does try to have an effect on the direction in which things are moving?
I think that all media has an effect on people's views and opinions. You can't produce a bit of journalism without influencing someone's mind subconsciously or consciously. So there's always this passive impact that you're having. But I do think that I do have a responsibility as a journalist to always tell the truth and to never lie or create propaganda. But I also think we have a responsibility to represent the entire public. And I think there's a lot of media institutions that dominate this space that come at it representing one half of the public's views, or how they choose their stories. They might be very selective and make a video or an interview or write a story about something that interests them and interests people that they politically agree with, but they'll ignore the other side. So a great example of this is, would a left-wing media group interview, say, a victim of someone who's been raped by an illegal migrant? Does that person deserve a voice in the media? Of course they do. And that's actually something that I've done for GB News. And I know that the BBC and other institutions would be much more reluctant to do that kind of journalism. So I think that there is a role for journalism coming at it from one perspective or another. I don't think there's any such thing as complete impartiality. There is such a thing as balance, where you can have both sides of the view, both viewpoints in your, say, documentary or film that you're making. And to a large extent, I do include both sides of the viewpoints when I'm making these documentaries. And when I'm doing a lot of these interviews, I do tend to challenge particularly politicians from their perspectives. A lot of the interviews that I'm doing aren't just softball, just nodding along. A lot of interviews that I've done, as I say, particularly with the politicians, I'm trying to ask very challenging questions. And that really has, caused me to have very difficult relationships with a lot of people that, I would agree with, or things that they would say that I would agree with. So I think it is my role to challenge, to tell the truth, to power. I know that sounds a bit cringy. I'm not some kind of like high-minded Wall Street Journal type who, democracy dies in darkness. I don't take myself that seriously. But I think there is all journalists have a responsibility to tell the truth. And for me, that's very, very important. And I think there is a big temptation when you're in this industry to subtly, change the story, or to fit a certain narrative. or to not quite, be truthful and honest in how you're presenting something. And that it really has been drilled into me time and time again, working at different newspapers in Britain. You mustn't do that. Everything has to be completely correct and factual.
Do you think, as you just mentioned, when you interview somebody with whose views you tend to agree, at least to some extent, that it's even more important to challenge those views, because this is also a way not just for you to challenge the ideas of the other person, but indirectly also challenge your own ideas and sharpen your own thinking. So in a sense, it's not your obligation to defend views you agree with, but to challenge them even more, to be certain that those views are, as far as this is possible, are the correct views.
Absolutely. And I always try to at least ask some challenging or questions from a different perspective to all of the people that I'm interviewing, because it makes for a more interesting interview for the viewer in the end. Because if it's just two people agreeing with each other, okay, that might make some people happy, but I think conflict always sells, and people want to see the person's views being challenged, so that it's not just a kind of mirror in an interview. And as I said, I particularly feel this is a responsibility or a duty when it comes to politicians who are standing for election, who want your votes, who could have a major influence on your lives. Of course, they should be challenged. Of course, it's my duty to do that. And I think that I come at it from perhaps a slightly different perspective than most journalists as well, because I try and ask questions from the right as well as from the left and from the center, but particularly from the right, where politicians, and again, this is a real thing that I find frustrating about, say, the BBC, is that almost every interview that they conduct is from the left, whether it's a left-wing politician or a right-wing politician. It's always, why aren't you spending more? Why aren't you increasing immigration more? Why are you such a racist? Why are you such a transphobe? Whatever. I'm slightly exaggerating there, but I am making a point that the BBC and others do tend to come at it from a very particular perspective. And they also lack a complete understanding of conservative views and conservative politics. And I think a lot of these interviewers and journalists, they're just simply ignorant of what their opponents or what their ideological opponents think and how they reason their arguments, and why people are angry about, say, immigration, and why people might be upset about very controversial topics, like, for example, the decline of the white British population. Would a BBC interviewer ever ask Nigel Farage or any other politician whether they're concerned that the British population is about to become, in the next few decades, minority white British? Of course they wouldn't, because to them, that's not a legitimate concern. That's not even on their radar. They wouldn't even think of that question. They wouldn't think it's a legitimate question. But actually, millions and millions of British people care about that. And I think it's important that politicians are asked questions that millions and millions of people have huge anxiety about. So I think I feel a kind of responsibility to ask those, more controversial questions, those questions from the right, which aren't being asked by mainstream journalists.
In trying to build a bridge between your work as a journalist and your interest in history and politics more generally, do you think it is fair to say that there indeed, and this dovetails nicely with what you just said, there has been, and I believe this is of interest not just to our British viewers and listeners, but also to the broader West almost, that over the last, and maybe you can, maybe you have an idea when this started, or you can pin it a little bit to a historical date if you want to, that there has been a growing segment of the population that really does not see itself represented in the mainstream media. Or let me rephrase it, maybe not represented, but not listened to, or that the issues they care about are barely touched upon.
It's an interesting, from a historical perspective, I know a little bit about the history of the media in Britain. I read a great book on Lord Northcliffe, who founded the Daily Mail back in the 19th century, late 19th century. And there has been some real innovators in the media world, where you have the people like the Murdochs and the Northcliffes. And actually, Rupert Murdoch's father was actually a mentee of Lord Northcliffe, Alfred Hamsworth, in the sort of 1920s, 1910s, And you can actually see his influence go all the way through to Rupert Murdoch and today. And I think people like Lord Northcliffe really did start to represent this new literate classes in the Edwardian and late Victorian era, where people are starting to read newspapers. And, he really was giving them a platform and a voice in a way that they hadn't had before, where newspapers and journalism had really been for the elites and for the kind of upper middle class. Unfortunately, in more recent years, particularly around the issue of immigration, I think that the media has let itself down in not asking some of those challenging and controversial questions, and for really gatekeeping views that they see as too extreme. Obviously, in Britain and the West and other, European countries, I think this has happened all across the board, where concerns from people who are generally more working class have been ignored by the media elites, even the conservative media elites. And that has really, I think, happened mostly in the 21st century. Because if you read someone like Charles Moore, a famous British journalist who used to edit The Spectator, I think he edited the Sunday Telegraph as well for a while. He is now obviously a major voice for that newspaper, The Telegraph. If you read what he was writing in the late 1990s on immigration, it was something that, Nigel Farage or even someone to the right of Nigel Farage today would be saying. Now he's much more moderate, Charles Moore, that is, on things like immigration. He's a big supporter of Kemi Badenoch and the more centre-right conservatism. So it does seem to me that this whole issue around race and DEI and wokeism and all of that stuff has really accelerated the so-called political correctness, which was, a huge issue that started to arise. Actually, it goes back beyond the 90s, but it was really talked about in the 1990s. I think that in the last 20 years, this has really caused people to not have representation in the media because media elites in conservative institutions, which is where they should be represented, are too scared to talk about this stuff. And they don't come from the kind of backgrounds that they used to. You've got a lot of people who are editing these newspapers who I think live in a kind of bubble, unfortunately. There are some great conservative actually editors, and I think The Telegraph is a brilliant example of this, where they've done a very, very good job on the whole of representing those kind of viewpoints that I'm talking about.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You used a word I want to focus on for a second, and that's the word a moderate position. And I've been wondering for a while, because we talked a little bit about the role of the media. And one of the things and that's an impression I have, and I'm curious to see if you have a similar one, that one of the key roles of the media in the past has been that they play a significant role in defining what the middle ground or the moderate position is. And as you just said, many of the things that would have qualified as moderate 40 years ago are perceived as being radical today. And there was also a movement in the other direction. So do you think that this is also one of the venues of influence of media, that they basically declare what the commons, whether it's true or not is a separate issue, but they more or less declare what the moderate, the common sense, the reasonable position is?
I think that's probably always been the case, actually, until very recently, because newspapers and to a certain extent broadcast TV news channels, they were really able to control the conversation around politics and gatekeep on both left and right what was acceptable to believe and to think. And then obviously you've got the rise of social media, the internet, where anyone on YouTube can start a YouTube channel like I did as a teenager. Anyone can write a tweet, anyone can become a citizen journalist, with all the good and all the bad that comes with that. The real monopoly that the media had on the public discourse has been broken. So I think for decades it has been true that the media has decided where the acceptable boundaries are. And now that has really changed in the last particularly 5 to 10 years. And I don't think you'd see a figure like Donald Trump be so successful without social media, without directly going to voters with his message, rather than through the traditional media outlets which would really, tame him or bring him in. It's interesting that there have been these populist figures which have been fairly successful in the past, despite this kind of stranglehold that the media had. And I think that's just because their message has been so strong. I'm not saying that I support this man, but I think that his rise was fascinating in 1964 and 1968. George Wallace, who was running for president in the States, he was the original kind of Donald Trump when it comes to populism. And again, I'm not saying that he agrees with Donald Trump on segregation. Donald Trump is completely the opposite to George Wallace when it comes to his views on race and segregation and African Americans. But he was so successful in 1968 and 1964 because he really spoke to a large group of Americans who felt that they were being ignored by the two mainstream parties. And I think today, people like Farage, people like Trump have really benefited from being able to speak directly to voters and not go through these gatekeepers in the media.
Now, do you think that, and I agree with that, and as you just said, on the one hand, there is a beautiful development, which is that with very little capital investment and with a very little technical equipment, you have many ways to share your views, share opinion. It can be video, it can be Substack, it can be YouTube, it can be Rumble, all of this. Do you sometimes wonder or fear that with the growing competition in that space of, let's say, independent and individual content creators, that there is then a shift from either putting the focus on something that has been neglected, or trying to really inform and look behind the curtain to say, okay, you have to be as provocative as possible, right? You have to be as outlandish maybe in your claims as possible because it generates clicks, it generates eyeballs. Or do you think that this is a fear that is overblown and that the mainstream media just is pointing at this to reestablish their gatekeeping function? Or do you think there is some truth to that risk?
Oh no, there's a massive truth to that. And I think it also impacts mainstream media. They're not sort of immune to trying to create clickbait, and institutions like the Daily Mail or Daily Express and a lot of these tabloid newspapers, and even some of the highbrow or so-called higher-brow papers have also gone down this route, where unfortunately for media organizations, there's much less money to be made now than there was 20 years ago, because their monopoly has been broken, because the internet can give you news for free instantly whenever you want it. Whereas 20 years ago, you'd have to buy a newspaper or watch the television. So this really has created incentives for people to create outrage, to frankly lie, and it doesn't just impact the media. It actually has a huge impact, obviously, on these independent creators as well. And I think, unfortunately, there is far too much slop, as it's been coined, out there at the moment on YouTube, on Twitter. I was in Portland recently making a film about the far left. And
tell us a little bit about this also.
Well, it links in with your question.
Yeah.
So I went to the ICE facility, which is where there's been nightly protests and in some cases riots from far left agitators. And rightly, a lot of conservative journalists have pointed this out and have gone to the ICE facility and records them every night and shows a lot of the violence that's coming from the far left. But I have to be honest with you and say, what I observed when I went and filmed there was also some right-wing content creators on Twitter, on X, trying to provoke the left-wing agitators. And it was a really pathetic sight, watching two sides screaming at each other, shouting insults, and sort of almost wanting to get into a scrap. And, I can just imagine a right-wing provocateur going there, screaming some terrible thing at a left-winger and encouraging him or her to get into a fight. And then suddenly that's portrayed as some kind of Antifa attack on a conservative journalist. And you don't get the full context of what's actually happening there. So there is a lot of nonsense going around, and Twitter and YouTube and all of these platforms, they appeal to narcissists. They appeal to people's worst instincts in wanting to become famous, in wanting to drive more outrage, more clicks as much as they can. And we're only human, whether you're conservative or liberal or left wing or whatever. This impacts everyone on both sides. So unfortunately, there is far too much slop out there and nonsense out there. When it comes to that far left film, I think this was, definitely one of the better films that I produced, if I may say so. I was interviewing a guy who was a former Antifa activist who was telling me in Seattle that he is terrified of these Antifa militants who he knows, who are telling him about going to gun ranges, who are telling him about preparing for a civil war, who talk about violence, who celebrate violence. And he told me that he is very worried that people could get hurt and that conservatives could get killed, as we've seen with people like Charlie Kirk. There was a Trump supporter that was killed in Portland a few years ago by an Antifa terrorist. When Donald Trump was nearly assassinated, let's not forget that a man actually died. I think it was a firefighter. A Trump supporter was killed in that attack. So we've seen over the last few years a huge rise in far-left activism and terrorism and violence in the United States. And I really wanted to document what was happening and why. And I spoke with some of those left-wing agitators outside of the ICE facility in Portland. And one of them was really flirting with violent ideas. When I would ask him, what do you say about these slogans and graffiti that we'd noticed all around Portland that said things like, and I'm going to quote verbatim here, kill Trump, kill ICE, kidnap ICE. Lots of other messages about murder, killing, kill pigs, Molotovs melt ICE, explicitly violent. And in the context of these several assassination attempts on Donald Trump's life, seeing this stuff, it's not just a joke for a lot of these people. So when I interviewed one of these agitators outside of the ICE facility and asked him about these slogans, he said, resist how you want to resist. He said that for now, I wish that we could stay peaceful, but there may be a stage in the future where we need to get more aggressive in fighting fascists. And he didn't quite say this, but he was flirting with endorsing the idea that it's acceptable to kill your political opponents. And I think it's really concerning that in the States, there is a significant minority of mentally ill, far left people who believe it's justified to murder what they believe are Nazis and fascists. And that really has been fueled by the media on the other side, the liberal media, the Democrats, who have been calling Donald Trump Hitler for the last 10 years, when he obviously isn't Adolf Hitler. He's the president of the United States. He's not putting people in death camps. There is no similarity that I can view between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, no serious one. And yet some people believe this and believe that if he really is Adolf Hitler, then the only thing to do is to kill him and to kill his supporters.
Now, you inhabit an interesting world because on the one hand, through your documentaries and your interviews, you are very much in tune with what's going on in the realm of politics. But of course, and we're not going to disclose your address, but you live in the United States, you live, your daily life, just all of us do. So do you think there is a disconnect or a difference between, let's say, the polarization or the heated rhetoric among those who are very much online, who again, who consume the kind of media that you just mentioned, and the quote unquote, however we want to define it, average person? Or do you think that this is slowly trickling down into let's say the more common people as well, who are not online as much as, let's say, the younger generation? And please, if you could, speak both to the United States, but also, of course, to the United Kingdom, where you're from.
It's more difficult for me to talk about Britain because I haven't been there for almost 2 years, but I can talk a bit about the UK and my experiences there. With the United States, it's a bit like we're in any kind of upheaval, and the US isn't quite in a civil war or anything near that, but in any kind of politically chaotic time throughout history, the vast majority of people are usually getting on with their lives. Even through the Second World War, people in Britain mostly just got on with their lives. They weren't stressing or being hysterical about the Second World War every single day. human beings have to adapt to the situation around them. So yes, most Americans are normal, are not thinking about politics, are not thinking about Donald Trump, are not thinking about the Democrats. It's a very kind of niche, agitated, but very vocal minority that are thinking about these things. And, it doesn't really impact my daily life in Washington, D.C. That people aren't talking about these things generally, people that I know. But when it comes to Britain, from what I understand and glean from my family, from my friends who are there, it seems like the mood is more freebile than ever. And I think people are really getting angrier and angrier every day with both Labour and the Conservatives, who they feel have betrayed them over the last 20, 30, 40 years even, ever really since Margaret Thatcher, particularly on the issue of immigration. And then we're also seeing people being locked up for Facebook posts. I think it's something like 30 people a day being arrested in Britain for online posts.
Is that really true?
Yeah, it's
Because
something like 12,000 a year.
Yeah,
this is 2023.
This is so outrageous. Every time this is, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but this is one of these instances where I hear it from you, and you're one of my favorite sources. I actually trust everything that you say, and you read this, and it is particularly in Britain, right? The cradle of modern democracy, of parliament, of free speech. The Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, and all these things. It's one of the things you hear it, and my almost gut reaction is that can't be true. That can't be true. But then, of course, you have the news like what's the Irish comedian Graham Linehan and others being arrested at the airport. So yeah, please continue. But it's so because you say that can't be true. That can't. But it is.
It's like everything you read about Britain online and in the news. You just think, is this real? Is this real? You just do a double take, because there just seems to be so much going wrong, unfortunately, in Britain, the country that I absolutely love. And I really miss it so much as well, sometimes, not all the time. But I think, and again, you've got to be honest and say, this isn't impacting everyone, and people are generally just living their lives. But I do think that the level of anger but towards Starmer, towards the Labour government, is just building up to absolute poison, complete resentment. I cannot see a way in which Starmer wins the next election. In this moment in time, I mean, maybe things can change, but he's so unpopular. I suspect he'll have to resign next year or the year after next. I can't see how Labour can continue him as the Prime Minister. But it's this issue, again, it always comes back to me, to immigration, because this is really something that both parties have pledged for decades to tackle, to reduce. And every time they do it, they go back on their word, and they can't keep making these promises and then doing the opposite on such an important issue, on an issue that really impacts not only the economy in a disastrous way, but also crime and culture and identity, which is something that I think that politicians on both sides seem to completely ignore. Or they celebrate diversity, they celebrate multiculturalism, which I know something that you can talk about with your interest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. How did that work out, for the Austro-Hungarians in the First World War, when you're trying to organize this kind of army with 100 different languages and dialects? And again, you just saw this in the Balkans in the 1990s. I'm really worried that Britain is heading in a really serious direction, because we have all these ethnic enclaves and, frankly, segregated societies in places like Birmingham and Leicester and other cities throughout Britain. There are just groups of foreigners who don't integrate, who don't speak English, who have their own religion and cultural practices that are not only different from Britain or British culture and history, but anathema to a lot of what Britain has historically stood for. We've historically been a Christian country. We're now more secular, but we're still rooted in Christian culture and ideas and values. And obviously, it's easy to focus on Islam because that's the most obvious kind of problem, if you like, with integration and multiculturalism in Britain. But there's also lots and lots of other cultures and societies that we've imported into the country who don't behave like British people behave. If you import lots and lots of Somalis into Britain who come from a war-torn country, who come from a country that's been ravined by civil war for decades, from a country that has no stable government, from a country that has a clan system, and if you drop those people into Britain, you think suddenly they're going to become just as British as anyone who's been there with family connections back hundreds or even 1,000 years. Of course they won't. And that's why, unfortunately, we've seen every single day, we see someone being raped by an illegal migrant. I know that sounds extreme to say that, and it almost sounds vulgar and like something, some terrible person would say at a horrible far-right rally, but it's true. And we have to be honest about these things. There are young girls in particular, thousands of whom have been raped by largely Pakistani men who have been treated like with utter contempt by the British state and the authorities who had a responsibility to protect them. And they continue every single year to import hundreds of thousands of people from places like Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. And the country is so angry because they've been told by their leaders, they've been told by their politicians that we weren't going to do that we were going to cut or even stop immigration. We were going to cut immigration to the hundreds of thousands. Boris Johnson won this landslide election in 2019 on the explicit pledge to reduce immigration. And what did he do? Not only did he do the exact opposite, he ranked it up to the record numbers it's ever been, particularly from third world countries. This is an utter betrayal, and I feel so passionate about my nation, my history, my culture. And it is a great tragedy, the greatest tragedy, frankly, of our recent history, that this immigration crisis has been allowed and continues to ramp up.
We once, a couple of weeks ago, had an off-camera conversation about the podcast The Rest is History, where they talked about Enoch Powell, which I think was very nice of them to dedicate an entire episode to this. And one of the things that stuck out to me in this podcast, and I know that you listened to it as well, so I'm not ambushing you here, was that when he gave his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, that apparently all the letters from the public to the newspapers, I think it was in the thousands, were supportive of his more general points. I don't think that everybody agreed with like the bits and pieces, but it's more general points. So this kind of betrayal that you speak of, and full disclosure, I agree with your assessment. Would it be fair to say that actually started in the 60s almost? Like it's very often like the right-wing populists, all of this started in the Trump 2016. But if you really go back, wherever we have something feasible to measure whether or not people were starting to become discontent with migration policy, I think you can genuinely say this started in the 1960s and people have been ignored for most of the time.
Ralph, it starts in the 1940s, frankly. You can go back to the very first ships that are coming from the Empire, the Windrush, famous Windrush ship that came from Jamaica to Britain. And even Labour MPs are saying at the time, this is madness. The governor of Jamaica, obviously Jamaica at the time was in the Empire, part of the Empire, who was a British governor, said, this is madness. Let's not do this. They shouldn't be going to Britain. There were some Labour MPs who supported it. Churchill was against this stuff. That was in the 1950s when he became Prime Minister again. At every single opportunity that this has happened, there has not been widespread support across the public for mass migration. And really after the Second World War, we started to see this flood, and I'm going to call it a flood, even though it was only tens of thousands of people, which seems relatively small to the numbers that we have today. Just in 1 year in 2023 and 2024, there was almost 1 million net migration to Britain. But in those decades after the war, just think about the impact the Pakistani and Indian communities have had on Britain in the last few decades, ever since they arrived in the post-war period. And now think that in 1 year, more Pakistanis, came to Britain than in those decades combined. So, or in that sort of 2020 to 2024 year period. And think of the impact that's going to have on British culture and society going into the 2040s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Of course, this betrayal goes back to, the very beginning. And in the 1960s, 1968, when Enoch Powell made his famous speech, yes, he had widespread support from the public. I've forgotten the exact number, but I think it was around 70%, maybe even more than that, supported Enoch Powell after that speech, looking at public opinion polls at the time.
And I think one thing is that all the letters they got, it was the journalists either at the BBC or the Telegraph, I don't remember, that they didn't get, again, according to the podcast, they didn't get a single letter disagreeing with Enoch Powell, but thousands agreeing with him.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
And this view, as this is the tragic and sad thing about this whole debate, is that we never wanted it. It was always imposed upon us. And despite it happening against our wishes, British people were incredibly accommodating and kind and supportive of these communities coming into the country. We were one of the least racist countries in the world. We had no issues that they had in the United States, where they had the significant black population because of slavery, the issues around segregation and so on. When GIs, American GIs, came to Britain in the Second World War, local British people actually got into fights with racist Southern Americans who were trying to segregate British pubs and institutions because they didn't want to be around the black soldiers who were in Britain preparing for D-Day. Britain has historically been an incredibly accepting society, and they could have continued that if only they'd listened to the concerns of the native population and kept immigration to an absolute minimum. Even the vast numbers, and I think it really was vast numbers, coming in after the Second World War, which compared to today, as I said, are nothing. If they just stuck to that, if they just kept immigration to a tiny number of people who could be integrated over decades and decades and decades, that kind of goodwill towards those migrants would still be there today. But instead they chose to frankly betray the public, go against their wishes over a huge period with elites in both parties and across the media. And now they've created a huge amount of resentment, which is totally and completely justified. Look at the amount of crimes committed by illegal and legal migrants in Britain. Not one of those crimes had to happen if the government had listened to the British public and to the British people. Think of the number of girls and boys whose lives would have been completely different had they not been raped. Again, this sounds vulgar, but we have to say it. Had they not been raped by people who should never have been in the country, who British people didn't want in the country. This is real. This is real stuff. Thomas Roberts wouldn't be dead, the young British Royal Marine, 21-year-old, who was stabbed in the heart by an illegal migrant who came into the country in 2018, if the British government had done their duty, which is their first duty, which is to protect the people. So it's so unfortunate. I want to write a book on this one day, on how this goes back decades and decades and decades of elites ignoring the population on this issue.
But wouldn't somebody say that, well, this is the price of empire? I guess this would be the counter argument. So, well, this is, as you said, I mean, when you mentioned Jamaica, that is, if you have the empire, at some point, the people from the periphery of the empire will come to the imperial metropolis.
I don't think that that's inevitable. I don't think that's democratic. I think the British people are sovereign in their own country and are allowed to decide who comes into their country, whether we had an empire or not. You can debate the merits and the disadvantages and all the terrible things that we supposedly did in the empire. There is no moral or legal obligation that means Britain has to be open to the entire population of India if they wish to move to Britain. There just isn't. Just as India has no moral or legal obligation to open its borders to any other country, just as all countries around the world have sovereignty and have borders and are allowed to decide who comes in and who can stay, no matter what that country has done to other countries. You could make an argument that every country in the world has performed some form of empire, colonization, invasion, and so on. That's just how countries work. That's what's happened throughout history. That doesn't mean that those countries then have to have open borders to the people that they'd previously colonized or conquered. No, we are allowed to choose who comes into Britain and who can stay.
My last question is, and this adds to this and kind of ties it all up. Do you think that we are experiencing, precisely based on what you just described, a little bit of a backlash? That one of the reasons why in the United States it comes in the form of America only and America alone and America first. There's all this. I'm lost track about all the America something and all the apparently new baseball caps that are coming out. But also you have rally the flag movements in the UK. And I'm not even, you don't even have to take a side on whether you find it justified or not. But do you think it could be described as a backlash against what you just were describing? That there simply is a sense of that patriotism or nationalism, or whichever one of those terms you want to use, has been demonized for so long that it is becoming, and again, I don't mean this as a value judgment, just a description, that it is becoming, particularly for young men, the new cool thing. And maybe if you touch a little bit, you mentioned left-wing movements. It's also a little bit of a, if we define wokeness as a somewhat of a feminine movement, and I think that is fair to say, that this is the kind of masculine, and again, not as a value judgment, just as a descriptive judgment, that this is a little bit a backlash that we are experiencing.
Absolutely. I think the problem that we've seen in Europe and in the United States is that the numbers have been so significant that we can clearly see this is having a huge impact almost everywhere. There are some places, particularly in America, which is such a big country, where immigration has touched far less than other places. So New York has obviously experienced a massive wave of migration, and that's visceral. But say somewhere in Iowa or whatever is not having the same impact. But yes, this is, to answer your question, a masculine phenomenon. If you look at opinion polls, there is a big gender divide between men and women, just on all topics when it comes to politics. And immigration is obviously a huge part of that, where women today generally support the left, men in America in particular generally support the right. And if you break that down, it's in particular single women who are supporting the Democrats, and married women are actually more likely to go Republican. So we're seeing that gender divide in Britain, in Europe as well. But it's also interesting when it comes to the young in particular. In Britain, far fewer young people are supporting conservative parties, reform or conservative, than say in Poland or France or the United States. And the United States is actually changing. And we saw in the 2025 off-year elections that young people were very heavily supporting people like Mamdani and so on. So there is a real gender divide. And I think that for decades, the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of feminine energy and feminine politics, frankly, that is all about empathy and kindness and comes from a kind of emotional perspective. And of course, that's not all, to be discounted. But I think we really have lacked that kind of masculine virtue, which is about having strong borders and a national identity. Because, and I love this phrase that's now being used, I've forgotten who coined it originally, but we now have this suicidal empathy where you feel it's justified to have soft on crime policies in places like Charlotte or Chicago, where you have career criminals who have been arrested 72 times, who a female judge in Chicago will then release on bail after allegedly assaulting a nurse and putting her unconscious, who then sets fire to a young woman. Same thing with this Ukrainian girl who was murdered in Charlotte just a few months ago. Again, her attacker had a massive rap sheet and again was let out by a female judge. So I think there really has been a domination, frankly, of politics, and Jordan Peterson and others talk about this, of the feminine perspective, the feminine energy. And as you say, there is a significant backlash in places like Britain, the States, and all over Europe, really.
On that note, Stephen Edgington, thank you so much for joining us. I hope we can do this again in the future.
Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate it.